All right, so we're diving deep today
Yeah.
into this whole
Yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein, Boris Epstein
Okay.
thing. We've got late night clubs, we've got foreign currency, presidential pardons.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Sounds like a wild ride.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, but it's a really interesting way to look at how power and influence work, and how they can sometimes shield people from being held accountable.
Yeah, I think that's what makes these stories so compelling.
Right.
It's like they're ripped from the headlines, but they also tap into these deeper anxieties we have about fairness and justice.
Exactly.
So I think starting with that nightclub scene is a good way to set the stage.
Okay, so imagine
Okay.
this crowded nightclub. Right?
Yeah.
It's pulsating with energy, strobe lights are flashing, people are dancing, bodies are sweaty, and in the middle of all this chaos,
Uh-huh.
we find George Carlin. He's nursing a scotch.
Okay.
And God is there too, enjoying a beer.
An unlikely pair
They are there.
for political commentary.
But there are guides,
Mhm.
our cynical, witty guides through this whole thing,
I like that.
And it's on this very night, the night that Jeffrey Epstein is supposed to be
Well,
in hell.
at least according to God.
According to God, right, that things get really interesting with Boris Epshteyn.
Boris, no, he's a fascinating character in his own right.
He is former Trump advisor, right? And he's got his own set of legal issues.
Indeed, indeed. So we have these two figures,
Yeah,
both Epstein,
both Epstein.
both connected to Trump, and both
Facing legal scrutiny.
yeah, facing legal scrutiny. It's a coincidence that makes you stop and think.
It does.
Is there something more here?
Right.
Or is it just random overlap?
So this is where the nightclub scene gets really interesting.
Okay.
Our sources tell us that Boris is, well, he's acting a little out of character. He's flashing this Trump card.
Literally and figuratively.
Literally, yeah, literally
Okay.
and figuratively. And then, get this, he tries to pay for a private dance
Uh-huh.
using rubles.
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 In a U.S. nightclub.
Yeah, I mean, talk about a disconnect, right?
It's almost like he thought his association with Trump and his wealth would just, I don't know, excuse any kind of behavior or
Like transcend boundaries.
yeah, transcend any kind of social or even practical boundaries.
And the club owner,
yeah,
he's not having it, not at all.
calls him out
Calls him out, things escalate, and Boris ends up being escorted out
in handcuffs.
in handcuffs.
Wow, so there are consequences,
Right.
even in that environment,
It seems like it.
even with those connections.
Yeah, for a moment.
For a moment.
Because here's the kicker.
okay,
A few days later,
yeah.
Trump pardons Boris Epshteyn.
Oh wow, that's interesting timing. So
Yeah.
much for consequences.
It's like
It just feels like
it makes you think about how power
yeah.
can shield certain people.
It really raises questions about fairness and accountability.
Yeah. And God actually predicts the pardon
He does
before it even happens.
before it even happens. So he's adding this layer of cynicism.
Right.
Like this was inevitable.
It makes you wonder, is this just how the world works for some people?
It's a question worth exploring.
And when we look at the two Epsteins, we see very different approaches
Yeah.
to this world of wealth and power.
Right. Like Jeffrey Epstein,
Yeah.
he was more of a mastermind operating behind the scenes
Right.
with these complex financial schemes.
And Boris, at least in this instance,
Yeah.
seems more like an opportunist.
Yeah.
Someone who's trying to leverage his connections for immediate gain.
Yeah. Less sophisticated, maybe?
Yeah, yeah. And it's this difference that makes you think about the nature of power itself.
Right. Is it about carefully cultivated influence over time?
Or is it about seizing opportunities in the moment?
Both approaches seem to offer a degree of protection, which
Yeah.
makes you wonder about the systems themselves.
Right.
Do they really serve justice?
Or do they just protect those who already have power? And let's not forget Carlin and God.
No, they're crucial to this whole narrative.
Their presence adds this layer of humor
Yeah.
and social commentary.
It's like they're pointing out the absurdity of it all,
Right.
but also the unsettling truths beneath the surface.
And they're prompting us to see the connections between this seemingly isolated incident
Uh-huh.
and the larger patterns of power and privilege,
Yeah, the bigger picture.
that shape our world.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
It is, but it's a conversation worth having.
Absolutely. It's when you look at Jeffrey Epstein that things get really dark.
Yeah, like his story, it shows the underbelly of power,
The way it operates in secret, using wealth and influence to silence victims.
And to escape accountability for years.
For years, and our sources go into detail about these financial schemes.
They were complex,
Incredibly complex.
involving offshore accounts, all these transactions.
Designed to hide what he was really doing.
Like one scheme they talk about,
Yeah.
used a bunch of shell companies
Oh, wow.
to move money around the world.
To make it untraceable.
It's like a financial labyrinth.
And that allowed him to operate under the radar for so long.
And until the pressure just became too much.
The public pressure.
And even then, there are still questions about his death.
Oh, absolutely.
And about the full extent of his network.
It's a chilling reminder of how power can be used
To manipulate.
To obstruct justice.
Yeah, it's almost like a warning,
About unchecked power.
Yeah.
The length people will go to
protect themselves.
to protect their interests.
And Boris Epshteyn's story,
Yeah.
it's troubling, but it feels,
Smaller.
focused on immediate gains.
Right, like a need to show loyalty.
Loyalty, yeah, that's a recurring theme in Trump's circle.
It is. And when you look at the pardon through that lens,
Yeah.
it almost looks like a reward.
For allegiance? Exactly, like stay loyal and you'll be protected.
It creates this sense of us versus them.
Right, like the rules don't apply to everyone equally.
So it begs the question, are all these events just coincidences?
Or is there a pattern here?
A pattern that reveals something deeper.
About how power works.
About the systems that allow this to happen.
Are they isolated incidents?
Or are they symptoms of a bigger problem?
And Carlin and God.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, their commentary.
That adds another dimension.
It's like they're reminding us that this isn't new.
These figures, the Jeffrey Epsteins, the Boris Epshteins,
They've always existed.
exploiting systems.
And Carlin's cynicism.
God's weary observations.
They make you think,
Yeah.
have we become numb to this?
To the displays of power, the lack of consequences.
It's a disturbing thought,
It is.
but it's one we need to confront.
If we want to understand how power really shapes our world,
The nightclub anecdote, as bizarre as it is,
it's a microcosm.
of these larger issues,
Wealth, entitlement.
the unequal application of justice.
And it raises the question,
What's our responsibility?
individually,
And as a society,
could challenge these systems.
to demand better. The implications go beyond.
Jeffrey Epstein.
And Boris Epshteyn.
This is about trust.
In institutions.
Yeah, and what happens when that trust erodes?
Disillusionment.
When people feel like those in power are above the law.
It's crucial to see this.
Yeah.
Their stories, as isolated as they might seem,
They point to a need,
for scrutiny,
accountability.
especially for the powerful,
Their actions, while different,
raise the same questions.
about power.
And its potential for abuse. And we've seen what happens.
When we look the other way,
The consequences can be devastating.
they can undermine justice itself.
So what can we learn from all of this?
From these seemingly separate stories,
What can we take away from these two Epsteins?
their entanglement with power.
Maybe it's a reminder.
That power, in all its forms,
Demands our constant attention.
our vigil,
And that we have to hold those in power accountable.
demand transparency.
Challenge unjust systems. Because the cost of complacency
It's too high.
and Carlin and God,
Yeah, their perspective here
it's almost cosmic.
is they see these patterns repeating throughout history.
Like they're saying, we've seen this all before.
Yeah,
Kind of funny, kind of scary when you think about it.
it is. It makes you think, are we doomed to repeat these cycles of power and corruption?
But maybe
Maybe.
if we understand them,
Yeah.
see how they work,
Recognize the patterns.
then maybe we can break free.
Maybe. There's hope in that.
So we started with this crazy story.
Yeah, that nightclub.
Boris Epshteyn trying to pay a stripper with rubles.
Wild.
And we went deep into power and influence.
Accountability, justice, all of it.
It's amazing how these things connect, right?
It is. It all comes back to that question of wealth and power.
Yeah, and justice.
Like, what's the relationship there?
How do connections, coincidences, how do they shape what happens?
Especially when it comes to legal consequences.
These are the things we need to be thinking about.
Absolutely.
Because both Epsteins,
Both of them.
despite all their legal problems,
They had powerful friends.
and it seems like they benefited from those connections.
It makes you wonder
It does if the system is rigged.
if it protects certain people.
And that's where
Carlin.
and God,
Yeah.
their commentary is so important.
They're like our conscience,
They keep us honest.
reminding us to question everything,
Especially authority.
to demand accountability
What would they say
about all this.
if they were here?
Carlin, I think he'd be all over the hypocrisy,
The irony.
the blatant disregard for the rules.
You wouldn't hold back.
Oh, absolutely not.
And God.
God, I think,
Yeah,
a sigh,
maybe a little sad.
recognizing human nature.
You know, it's flaws.
But maybe a glimmer of hope, too, when we bring these stories into the light
When we talk about them,
and examine them.
that's where change starts.
It's like they're urging us to pay attention,
To never stop questioning.
to demand better
From our leaders.
from our systems.
From ourselves.
The story of Jeffrey Epstein and Boris Epshteyn,
It's not just about them.
it's about all of us.
It's about the choices we make.
The systems we allow.
The world we create.
Together.
We started with a bizarre anecdote,
Ended up in some deep philosophical territory.
but that's what these deep dives are all about, right?
Exploring, questioning.
Trying to make sense of the world.
And it's the conversation that's the key.
That's what matters.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.